tracking the amazing growth of the first century church to challenge and inspire the 21st century church. This is Unstoppable Church, Then and Now, recorded on location in Israel, Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, Malta and Italy. Bible teacher and church pastor Mike Beaumont is in conversation for the next 30 minutes with David Taverner.
Of the 7 churches of Revelation, number 5 is Sardis. Now, we are in Sardis, here in Turkey. How far have we come from Thyatira, where we were last time?
We've come about 35 miles, what's that, 55, 56 kilometres to the southeast of Thyatira, David, to this, again, another amazing city, but very different to many of the others. Like many of the others, it had been devastated by an earthquake in AD 17 and had been rebuilt with the help of Rome. But one of the great things that stands out here that we've seen is a huge acropolis, that huge rock outcrop that towers up about 1,500 feet above the ground roundabout. And originally that had been the heart of the city, and the city's natural defences there had made it a great capital of kingdoms of the past. But by our period, by John's period, its importance was waning and the city had moved down to the plain below. But as you and I have seen today, very, very extensive, in fact, and was probably 100,000 plus in size in those days.
What can you see here today?
Well, we've seen all sorts, haven't we, as we've looked around. One of the things that clearly would have dominated the city in those days was a great temple to Artemis. We've met her before in other places, of course. But this was an absolutely massive structure. And even as you look at it today, it's really quite overwhelming in size. And it was twice the size of the Parthenon in Athens. Twice the size. So, I mean, that's huge. One of the 7 greatest pagan temples in the Greco-Roman world. So a massive temple is one thing that we've seen.
And that would have dominated every aspect of life.
Oh, absolutely, as the temples and religion always did here. And she wasn't the only one, of course. There were other temples here to Artemis, Cybele, etc., etc. Each place had its own, but Artemis was the one who dominated life here. There's also a huge Jewish synagogue. Now, the remains that we've just looked at, again, vast, absolutely enormous. I don't think I've seen a synagogue quite that big. That particular one comes from a later period than we're looking at, but again reflects that there must have been a sizable Jewish community here at the time that we're looking at.
And right next door to that Jewish synagogue, which is sort of under a covered roof to protect it, an enormous building. Just explain what that is.
Yeah, the gymnasium. Fantastic building. And really it was obviously, again, huge in early times. Gymnasium, not quite what we think. You know, going to the gym these days means, you know, going to do circuit training or working out on the bars, doesn't it? Gymnasium in those days was where you trained both your body and your mind. So you were educated, but you also kept physically fit. But again, huge, suggesting, you know, the breadth of life that went on here and the significant size of population as well.
What else was Sardis sort of famous for?
Well, it was famous for a number of things. One is they like to tell you that this is the place where coins were first minted, and that's probably true as far as this area of the world was concerned, though I suspect places like China might contest it there. But obviously very important, minting coins here. Why did they mint coins here? Well, the area was widely known for mining electrum. Electrum is a natural gold and silver alloy that's found in the surrounding mountains. And as you've seen, as we look around from here and as we've driven here today, there are mountains all around the plain here, and this alloy can be found there. And they found a way of separating the gold and the silver from that alloy and establishing its purity. So it was known for that. It was also known for its textile industry, and there'll be a reference to that in the letter that we're about to read.
But you're saying that it had known success, but that had changed.
Yes, it was past its heyday, as we might say, and it was living on its reputation somewhat, I suppose, like a lot of places do in the world, and frankly like a lot of churches do in the world as well, which is why this church is still so relevant to us today, because we've called this particular episode Awakened, because that's exactly what the church here needed to be. It needed to be awakened, to come alive, and not just to rely on its past reputation, as the city itself had relied on its past reputation.
So what was it that the vision that John had was saying about this church?
Well, let's read, shall we, from Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1. To the angel of the church in Sardis write, "These are the words of him who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your deeds complete in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you've received and heard. Obey it and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They walk with me, dressed in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out his name from the book of life, but will acknowledge his name before my Father and his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches."
Yet again, I've noticed, following the pattern with these letters to the churches, there's a description of Christ and a description of the church.
Yeah, absolutely. And we keep getting that pattern every time, don't we? The command to the angel, the description of Christ, different each time, but all of these pictures building up, of course, to give us a big picture of who he is. And then, a point about how he knows the church. Now, Sardis's letter is interesting because it is the shortest of the 7 letters, but it's also the sharpest of the 7 letters. I mean, it sort of, it goes in with the knife. And we read there, Jesus says, "I know your deeds." Now, that could sound like he's going to say here, "Oh, I know your deeds. You know, you've been doing so well. Well done, guys. Thumbs up to you." But the word that's used there in the Greek is eido. It means to perceive. I see through what is there on the surface and perceive what's really going on. I know your deeds. I can see what you've been doing, but I can see beneath it. You have a reputation of being alive, but are dead. So it looks like this church was very much living sort of on its past glory, on its past reputation, which was a little bit of a reflection on this city itself by this period in time, relying on past reputation, past glories, living in the good old days, but failing to see that that wasn't being matched with life now. And Jesus says, I see through that. I see through surface reputation. So deeds unfinished, he talks about as well. I see your deeds being unfinished. Does that mean it never finished anything it started, which is like some people, isn't it? That they never stuck at things? Or does it simply mean they weren't getting on with the task of evangelism in this challenging city that they ought to have been? I read one commentary that described the church here as the perfect model of inoffensive Christianity. I mean, they were okay, they were Christians and, you know, people knew them and they were surviving here in the city. But it was inoffensive. They weren't, and I'm not saying we should go out and be offensive, but they weren't making an impact on their community today because they were relying on their reputation.
Is there a danger that the church can do that today still?
Oh, absolutely. And I've seen that happen in churches of all kinds and types and sizes. I mean, for some, obviously, there's a danger of relying on the reputation that you are the state church, and that gives you certain privileges, responsibilities, even powers and therefore you ought to be respected. For other churches, it's the fact that they had a great preacher, a big name back in the 1950s and 60s, and built up a huge church in those days, which is wonderful. But really, they've been living off that reputation ever since, and the reality is not what it once was. So whatever sort of church you are, whether your reputation is rooted historically over thousands of years, or, it just goes back to a few decades ago, or to a couple of years ago, when you had a great outreach or you made a great impact on the town. Reputation is great if you build on it, if you do something with it. Reputation can be a door opener. I don't think there's anything wrong with churches having a good reputation. I'm glad to say the church that I'm part of has a good reputation in Teesside, including with this sort of political and local authorities, because of the way that we engage in community. But we can't rely on that. What we have to do is we have to build on reputation, not rest on reputation.
I suppose it's true that a church can be busy doing nothing or virtually nothing.
Yeah, we're very good sometimes, aren't we, at sort of moving the chairs around, as it were, and our diaries are very full. I certainly remember when I was a little boy and I used to go to church with my grandma when I visited her, and they managed to squeeze in 3 meetings on a Sunday, and that was seen as not very good, really. Well, I suppose most of us have one these days, but we can still end up being busy doing stuff, but it's often stuff for us, stuff to make life better for us, stuff to be comfortable for us, rather than fulfilling that mandate that Jesus gave us, that we've seen so many times now in our series, going right back to Acts chapter 1, verse 8. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, so that you can build comfortable meetings and enjoy yourselves. No, it doesn't say that, does it? So that you can be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, here where we are, in Sardis and in this part of the world, wherever you are now. And Jesus is calling upon the church at Sardis and calls upon us not to settle, but to stir ourselves and to be awakened as this church needed awakening, to get on with the task that lay ahead of it.
Does Jesus, through John, say anything positive about the church here?
Well, actually he doesn't, which is amazing, isn't it? There's no commendation, only rebuke. He goes straight into it. These are the words of him who holds the seventh spirit. I know your deeds. You've the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. So that's why I said earlier, this is the shortest letter, but it's also the sharpest letter. Now, this is weird because this church had a reputation. This city had a reputation. And yet Jesus has nothing positive to say about it. And so he calls them to wake up. There's this image here, wake up. Now, that would have been particularly significant in light of the history here in this city. I mean, Sardis seemed an impregnable fortress. You only have to look at that huge Acropolis that we've been by that really was virtually impregnable. But there were at least 2 occasions in its history when it had been defeated, when people had actually got up that Acropolis. One was in 546 BC and one was in 214 BC. And the reason the Acropolis was taken was because the watchmen fell asleep. And so this image of wake up would have been very powerful in a city where that had been their history. Wake up and strengthen what remains. Okay, so there was something that remained, but what remained was external form. Now, I think that has to be a big challenge for us in the churches today, whatever kind of church we are, whether we have a formal liturgy that we follow or a supposedly informal one that can often be as formal as the other way. It is very easy to end up just with external forms, either of our worship or our prayer life or our outreach life, that lacks the vitality, that lacks that fire in the belly that we've often talked about.
We're told we live in a post-Christian age. So is the sort of church asleep?
Well, I think it has been asleep, which is why we have ended up in a post-Christian age. But you know what? In some ways, I'm glad that we're in a post-Christian age, because the Christian age that we used to be in, the Christian age that I grew up in, was very much one of external forms of, people doing the right thing or going to church occasionally because that was the right thing to do, of saying they were Christians but they weren't really. So I think the fact that a huge chunk of our society would no longer identify as Christian actually helps us, not hinders us. While so much of our society in Britain said, and in the West said, we're Christians, but it's obvious they weren't because they'd not had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ, it made evangelism very hard. But now I think it's much easier when people say, I'm either atheist or I'm nothing or I don't know. What a glorious opportunity to stir ourselves and to wake up and to find new ways of reaching them. We can't always reach people in the ways that we used to reach them years ago. But I think these are incredible opportunities. And one of the wonderful things about the postmodern world in which we live is it might have rejected Christianity, but it hasn't rejected spirituality. There's vast interest in being spiritual in the West today. And so there's a wonderful platform for the church to wake up and to say, okay, how can we build on that platform? How can we engage with that and take people from their desire to be spiritual to leading them to know more about Jesus, who alone has the truth and can lead them to what they're looking for.
What's his reference in the vision to the thief in the night? That sort of sounds like it rings a bell.
Yeah, but it probably rings a bell for the wrong reason. So here's this big challenge here: to wake up. Remember what you've received and heard, obey it and repent. If you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come. Now, that's an image that is used elsewhere in the New Testament, for example, in 1 Thessalonians 5 and 2 Peter 3, of the return of Jesus. And there it speaks about Jesus will return suddenly and unexpectedly one day. And so the writers often used to use this image of a thief coming in the night. No thief puts a note through your letterbox and says, P.S. I'll be dropping in around 3 a.m. tomorrow to rob you. He comes suddenly and unexpectedly. So it's a very common image of the suddenness and unexpectedness of the return of Jesus. But that's not what's being referred to here. That he's not talking about the second coming here. He's saying, if you don't wake up, then I will come suddenly in judgment against you, who? My church. So here is a challenge once again, like we've seen before in some of those other churches, a challenge to the church, not the world, a challenge for the church to open the doors, a challenge for the church to wake up, a challenge for the church to open its eyes and have eye ointment put on it so it can truly see, and so on.
It sounds like the church needs a wake-up call, a bit like you get in a hotel for the morning call.
Yeah, I got one of those the other day when we had to get up very, very early for one of our journeys. And I suppose that's what this is. It is Jesus' wake-up call to the church here. And what I love is, he's not writing it off, but he is warning it. And I think here's the striking thing. Jesus is saying, look, wake up. Wake up. If not, I'll come like a thief in the night. And it's like Jesus is saying, if you're not going to wake up and do what I've called you to do, then frankly, you might as well not be here. And I will come in judgment and I will replace you. It's interesting that this part of the world is not strong in Christian churches and Christian faith.
Each of these visions from Jesus to John include a promise. What's the promise for Sardis?
Well, let's read it again. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. So he's seeing here that there's a handful who have stayed faithful, and those who have been faithful will be with Christ in eternity, he's going on to say. Now, that reference of not soiling their clothes, Sardis was well known for its textile industry, and many of the temples in those days barred worshippers from entering if they had soiled clothes on. It was seen as like offending the deity, a bit like years ago. Men would offend God if you came in with a hat and if women came in without a hat. So many of the temples saw soiled garments in that way. And what he's saying here is, the pagans down the road worry about going into their temple with soiled clothes. But actually, many of you in the church, you're not bothered. You're not bothered about having soiled clothes. But those who have not got soiled clothes, a picture language, those who have kept their lives right with me, will overcome. That's a theme that keeps coming out in these letters again and again. And he who overcomes will, like them, be dressed in white. I'll keep you, Jesus is saying there. I'll never blot out his name from the book of life. The book of life, here's the idea of God having a ledger in heaven, a ledger of the redeemed. It's an idea actually that runs throughout the Bible. It goes way back to Exodus 32 is the first time we meet it, when Moses is talking with God and says, Lord, I'm pleading on behalf of your people. Please take them with you, and if not, blot my name out of your book. So this idea that God has a list of those who are his. So I will never blot out his name. What a fantastic promise to know that if we put our trust in Jesus and if we stay faithful to him, he will never blot out our name before the Father and his angels. That's tremendously encouraging, tremendously reassuring.
It would be easy to think that these messages were just for these churches, these 7 churches, but how relevant they are for us today.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we've said that, haven't we, about each of them. Why 7 churches anyway? Well, there were 7 churches that John had responsibility for in this part of what we now call Western Turkey. But 7, of course, was well known in Judaism as a symbol meaning of God or perfection, the perfect number. So in talking about 7 churches, John is addressing these 7 churches, but he's also addressing every church in every situation throughout the world. And these 7 are sort of pictures of them. So this is absolutely just as relevant to us, that in any area of life, whether it's our church, our youth group, our Sunday school, my own personal life, if I've got a reputation of something, but the reality and the reputation are far apart from one another, here's the call of Jesus in this particular speech to this particular church, is to be awakened, to not be content with mediocrity. I think that's what he's after. Stop settling for mediocrity. Stop settling for it will do, in your own life. Have you read the Bible? Well, I've read it a bit, but it will do. Have you prayed about this recently? Well, I offered up the quick prayer, but it will do. How are you serving your community? Well, we're doing this, but it will do. And actually, all of that is mediocrity. And I think this church here in Sardis is being challenged for having settled into mediocrity. They were there, they were all right, but they were so relying on past reputation, like the city was, that they had settled for mediocrity and therefore inoffensive Christianity. And we can still do the same today.
This word, wake up, it rings bells with songs perhaps we sing in church, maybe even hymns, wake up, O sleeper, and things like that. And I wonder whether as we sing those words, whether we do appreciate exactly what we're trying to say.
No, I'm sure we don't. There are lots like that, and there are lots in the Psalms as well, aren't there? But maybe next time we come to a song that has something like that, it would be a good opportunity for us to stop and to check our own heart and to say, well, am I asleep? Have I settled for mediocrity? Have I settled for living on past reputation? Am I bumbling along? I'm all right, but I'm sort of bumbling along. And I think that's what had happened with this church. It was all right, but that's all it was. It was all right. And I suppose, therefore, the challenge I take for me is Do I want to settle for being all right? Well, I don't think I do. I don't want to settle for just being all right. I don't want my church to settle for just being all right. I don't think Jesus wants his church to settle for just being all right, living with mediocrity, inoffensive Christianity, slightly spiritually asleep. Just all right isn't enough. We need to be awakened if we're going to continue to be unstoppable church in our generation.
And making a difference with those words of Jesus that are just coming to mind, being salt of the earth. So you actually have an effect, if you like, in the world in which you operate.
Yeah, and that effect is either a good positive effect or it's a mediocre or negative effect. So Jesus said, didn't he, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. And the thing about salt is it was used to stop things going rotten, and it was also used to preserve and to add flavour. And that's what we are called to be in our own time as Christians, not mediocre, but as people who make a difference, as people who add flavour to life. When you go to your family who aren't Christians, when you go to your place of work or your place of education, do you add flavour there? Do you add something there? Do you make a difference there? Do you bring light there? So anything but mediocrity, anything but drowsiness. The church is called, just like the church in Sardis, to be awakened.
Mike Beaumont and David Taverner, travelling from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond to track the amazing growth of the first century church and what that means for the unstoppable church of the 21st century. There are more Bible podcasts from Mike and David on the UCB Player app and major podcast platforms. Check out Jesus Then and Now or Bible Books in 30 Minutes.